No mai, haere mai. Welcome to More Than Theology. Today's topic is the unhurried and the unharried life. And to talk about this, I've got my good friend Mark Forrest here. Let me tell you a little bit about Mark. Mark and I are friends. We belong to the same church, and Mark has a lot of strings to his bow. Mark is, as he just reminded us just before this podcast, he's a tradie, he's a builder, but he's also done a lot of other things in his time. He's the church that we belong to, he's held various positions on staff there, is very connected to the community, often been involved in community work there. He's a Bible teacher, preacher. Yeah, you are, man.
Okay,
you are.
okay, cool.
Did his theological training at Kerry Baptist College, and recently, also massive cricket fan. Probably in my circle of friends, he is sort of the go-to cricket expert. Recently I heard Mark talking about or preaching on the topic of prayer, and I've heard tons of sermons on prayer, but this one it did some stuff that I thought was kind of new, and I just realized. I think I already was aware, but it kind of reiterated for me that this is something that Mark is invested a lot of his own time, his own sort of mental energy into understanding, and something that he seeks to practice in his own life. And so I just really appreciate what, Mark, you had to say in that sermon. And so I just thought, let's get him on the podcast and talk to this guy about prayer. And I think we could think of Mark as a little bit like the Brother Lawrence kind of a guy who's, Brother Lawrence was a guy who's written an absolute classic in spiritual formation. And a lot of his spiritual formation was happening while he was in the kitchen. Yeah. And, Mark is a guy who works with his hands, and there's just real spiritual depth. And Mark would be the last person to say that, right? But it's true. And so I think we're going to have a good conversation. So, Mark, anyway, thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
And this is a privilege. It's cool.
Yeah, very cool. Cool. So, the topic that we wanted to talk about was, it's about prayer, but sort of framed in terms of the fact that we're just really busy people. And this topic of busyness, being in a hurry, being harried, that's sort of, I know, something that you've thought a lot about. So how did this topic of busyness become important to you personally?
It's been a journey. It's been a journey that's happened to me rather than anything I've necessarily sort of sought, just with different things. I guess a couple of years ago, I just found that I was reflecting on where I was at in life and how I was skating across the surface of life so quickly that you have these conversations with people in their twilight years, and they say, life just goes so quickly. And I don't think you can stop that. Life just goes quickly, but to find ways to deliberately slow down and at least enjoy the things that as they're happening, the things that make memories, the stuff that you'd remember, on your deathbed, the relationships, the connections and stuff like that. And I found that I probably wasn't prioritizing those as much as I was prioritizing what I was doing, what I was, busy achieving or succeeding at or doing or sort of whatever. I was just, I was racing along, and life was racing along really, really quick. I just realized that my girls were this age. My oldest daughter had just started high school. I'm like, man, 5 years she's going to be gone. And am I going to get to, she leaves school, I'm going to be like, wow, where did that go? Yeah. Because I was so busy doing my thing. So that was a real pause to stop and sort of check myself. I'd been working in a fairly intense environment, building a good environment, working for really good people, doing some pretty cool projects. Like we built a couple of retirement villages, some like multi-million-dollar, like tilt slab concrete, epic architectural places that were they were a challenge, but a good challenge, like really rewarding to actually drive past those houses now and say, man, I was part of that. I mean, we built a monument in the middle of Cambridge. I got to work on a monument that my grandchildren will tell their children that, your great-granddad was part of building that.
It looks awesome. I love it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, right? So, I mean, that's a real unique sort of an opportunity that I'm really, really grateful for, and the things that I learned there. But I found that I was really so intensely in that environment, in my head, just so into what I was doing that I wasn't really I don't know, being a whole-rounded person, and that's not an indictment on the environment or the firm or the employers or anything like that. It was me that needed resetting, and I guess I found that I couldn't really reset still in that environment. So I at the beginning of each year, like for 2-3 years in a row, I'd sort of taken some time for solitude and just gone and prayed and like, Lord, what is your will for me in this thing? Like, where are you leading me and stuff? And I remember at the beginning of 2018 and again in 2019, just stopping and praying, God, I'm struggling with this pace of life. I'm struggling with this rhythm or lack of rhythm. Like, show me how to, release me from this or show me the next thing. And I just sort of felt God saying, you're exactly where I want you to be. You're my man for this place. I want you to be here. I was like, oh, okay, buckle up for another year. Yeah. And it would be a really rewarding year. We'd do some cool stuff. And I'd get to the end of the year, though, just exhausted. I'd just collapse into Christmas. It'd take me 2 weeks to recover. And then it was time to go back to work. So it was just, life. I was almost, looking back, almost sleepwalking through that time. And I remember Zoe, my wife, had reminded me of, that thing happened in 2018, and and I barely remember it. Like I was there, but I wasn't fully present because my head was in something else. Like just, and then again at the beginning of 2020, I just again took that time away, and Lord, just struggling with this. 2019 had been a great year. Lord, release me from this, show me the next thing, and I just felt the sense of God saying, "Okay, quit." I'm like, what? Is that what? What do I do with that? And so I didn't just quit because I felt a voice telling me. I talked to some trusted people around me. I was like, look, what do you think about this? They prayed through that and just had some sort of sense of guidance from them as well, but really felt that, this is a time for a new season. So, okay, God, you're telling me to quit. What next? Silence and crickets and tumbleweeds. So it was really a faith step and a bit sort of scary stepping to the unknown, like just leaving my job without any idea what was going to happen next. But I did that. I had 4 weeks holiday that I just sort of took and chilled. It's been a pretty interesting ride over the last couple of years since then. And I've found that this has more been a season of who God wants me to be than really what he wants me to do. Being grounded in who I actually am in this time, this place, this surrounds, rather than what I'm doing, achieving. So much of my life has been revolved around achieving and doing stuff, even back to childhood and adolescence, as I unpack some of that. But actually who we are in this time, is just so important. And I think we lose that in our rush almost to, I don't know,
right,
rush to whatever it is, climbing the ladder against potentially the wrong wall,
Yeah. I've got a friend on Facebook who sometimes uses the hashtag "These are the good old days," and I think that is sort of trying to capture a bit of that idea that we don't want to just get into our dotage and look back and think, oh, those were the good old days. But it's like, it's right now. We want to be present for that. And you mentioned that, you felt like the sense of busyness you had wasn't the fault of the workplace, or it was you, but there is a sense in which we are all breathing this kind of cultural air, right? That is, it's not just us as well. There's something kind of bigger going on.
Yeah, it is. I mean, our Western culture is such a doer culture, right? It's such an achiever, a striver, building these empires and all this stuff. And but we're not particularly grounded within that. And I think we see that across with our mental health statistics, the levels of anxiety. I was reading somewhere the other day, I think it was a US study, but I think it's probably as relevant here, that they were doing toxicology studies on creeks, and they were finding not only was there quite large traces of antidepressants in the creeks and the stream water, they're actually finding the same antidepressants in the brains of the fish in those streaks. It's nuts. And our, we're living on antidepressants to help get us through this thing. It's like, what the heck's with that? Like, something's out of whack here. And so it's not a work environment or a boss or a whatever, a client or whatever. It's bigger than that. It's particular in the construction environment in some ways. Like, construction environment, a lot of people don't realise, actually has the highest suicide rate of any industry in New Zealand.
Wow.
We've taken that over from farmers in the last 4 or 5 years. So that's not farmers, I think, have sorted their act out a little bit in terms of actually banding together and supporting each other. It's such an isolated and intense, but different sort of intense.
Yeah.
Builders have got, it's not just builders, it's tilers, it's plumbers, it's designers, it's the whole construction game, but it's something particularly intense and harried. And this was like 2018, 2019. This is before COVID disrupted supply chains and no gym board until August sort of a thing. Like, it's next level now. But it's a pretty, flustered sort of just a intense game, hard to manage. So that's trying to make sense of that and trying to find balance is, something that's been on my heart a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, cool. So a piece of research that I came across a while ago had people comparing their days or their weeks, their routines in the sort of 1960s or so with people, this study was maybe 10 years ago, and they found that people weren't actually all that much busier now. It was pretty comparable, but people reported feeling so much busier now. So objectively, we don't necessarily have more to do, but subjectively, we feel harried. We feel hurried and harried. Do you have any kind of insight into what that's about, that subjective feeling of being in a hurry all the time?
I think that's true, that we're probably not, in terms of hours per week, more busy, certainly in a work environment. My dad worked more hours than I have for years. So for me to say, oh, I'm so busy, Dad's like, what the heck's wrong with you, man? I was working like more hours a week than you were, and it's true. I think it's not so much the time spent doing stuff, but the headspace given to that stuff. I think the environment's, I think, probably more intense now. We take it home with ourselves more. You can check your emails when you get up in your morning with your phone beside you. No one took a fax machine and stuck it beside their bed, right? Like, that wasn't a thing. So, you left work at work. And it sort of stayed in its place. And then I remember growing up, Dad had come home, he'd had a hard day at work, it was stressful. I mean, he was in a middle management sort of a position. There was a lot going on with that. He sometimes went back to work after dinner and catch up on a bit of pricing when the phone wouldn't ring. But after dinner, he'd sit and watch the news and just fall asleep to old Holmesy, and and then he'd get up and he'd do a bit of study upstairs or whatever, and that was his rhythm. So he was able. There was perhaps more of a rhythm in that, not necessarily that it was. I'm sure there was stress involved in that, and I was too young to realise, too young and ignorant. Whereas now, I think we're more constantly engaged in what we're doing, and probably more scattered within what we're doing as well. Just the amount of distractions, the amount of noise, the amount of other stuff going on. I mean, our sources of information were the morning paper and the midday news, whereas now it's constant 24/7 news feeds that you can just be in the loop on everything that's going on around the world, and it's all instant, it's in your face. Social media is constantly on us, telling us what's going on, and so much information, so much more so than there was 20, 30 years ago. But half it's useless information in the sense that there's nothing we can do about so much of it, or nothing that we're compelled to do about so much of it. So there's a lot more going on in our heads, and I think that it just sucks the headspace out of us, that we're emotionally and mentally far more tired than we were. And there's no space for boredom. There's no space to actually just sit and think. I mean, no one's been bored since like 2007, Like, I mean, there's so much going on where we used to just sit and stare at the window bored. Now we go play, I don't know, Candy Crush or, whatever. I mean, I go, geez, my drug of choice is like Cricinfo, being a cricket fan, I can spend hours just looking through, it's not, I mean, does it help me relax? Well, maybe a little bit, but there comes a point where that becomes unhealthy, because I'm actually losing time where I could be refueled by actually the nothingness, the being bored, because that's where you start to create, you start to think, you start to reflect, you start to, all that stuff, and we don't do that. So I think it's a sign that we're probably less grounded now than we were 30, 40, 50 years ago, because people had time to actually be. Now we're just like skating across life so quickly and not actually putting roots down. I think it's part of it. Yeah, so you just started to touch there on the fact that we don't spend too much time in reflection. I guess my kind of question is like, what do you think is wrong with being in a hurry, like, and living these kind of fast-paced lives? What is it that's toxic or unhealthy about that? I heard someone say that we have access to more information than we've ever had before, but we're lacking wisdom. And so wisdom doesn't come from sheer volume of information, it comes from actually applying it. And part of that is actually learning to grow in depth. So we're not putting those roots down. We're not grounded because we're going so fast that we just don't have a chance to put those roots down into things that really sustain us in busy times. Hurriedness is fine. Like actually being busy is working itself as a God-given thing. I mean, men and women were put in the garden to till and the earth before the fall. So work in itself is not a bad thing. You read the new heavens and the new earth in Isaiah 65, and he talks about, in that time, people will build houses and live in them. People will plant vineyards. And it's like this building and planting. I mean, I don't care what anyone says. You can't do that without some blisters, some blood, sweat, and tears. So that's in the new heavens and new earth sort of realm. So work in itself isn't a bad thing, but it's that balance. It's that rhythm of, having once gone to work, blood, sweat, tears, like planting, and then a resting season, allowing the seed sown to germinate, to plant, and then waiting on, and God's merciful sunshine and rain helping the seed to grow and stuff. So there were rhythms to that, whereas now we're just going constantly. So there's no rest, there's no rhythm, there's no to and fro to that. I think is probably part of that. I think as well. Just the constancy of what's going on, and the hurriedness was in terms of that classic fight or flight mechanism, right? You go back to primitive cultures, and they lived in this sort of tribal environment, and they'd be out walking through the jungle or whatever, and then a tiger would jump out and, heck, what have I got to do? Fight, flight, freeze, whatever. To fight the threat, the adrenaline levels would pop up. You could do superhuman things. You could climb a tree, kill the tiger, whatever. And then, you'd be carried by that adrenaline. But then after the threat had gone, you'd come back to normal. And that would happen once or twice a year sort of a thing. So our bodies are wired to be able to fight that. I was talking to my osteopath about this 2 or 3 years ago, and he was saying that the actual biological response in that fight or flight thing that would happen when someone was fighting a tiger, we have that response daily and several times daily. We're fighting tigers in traffic, we're fighting tigers at work, we're fighting tigers at home, we're fighting constantly. That adrenal response is happening so much, it's actually adrenal fatiguing us, and it's actually having a biological impact on our health, really unhealthily. So hurry, it's a rhythm of life, but if we're doing it all the time, then it's going to empty the tank so quick that it's actually not healthy. So we're quite literally not healthy human beings as a result of our hurry.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I heard something similar with talking about the effects of adrenaline, and when you have those adrenaline jolts, there's all sorts of other bodily functions that switch off at that time. They've found with, studies on lab rats and that kind of thing that when they're stressed and the adrenaline's kicking in, they're not growing. They're not those sorts of other kinds of developmental things that are just part of healthy life don't happen. So presumably you're stressed a lot of the time, then there's all these other sorts of things that shut down. And
it sets a new normal as well, because you then get used to that, and then to find ways to settle down. You can't sleep properly, so then you need sleeping pills. You can't relax properly, so you start narcotizing ourselves is this phrase of finding ways to actually, whether it's actual narcotics, I mean, as addiction sort of comes in, or just finding other things, just other vices that just distract us away from. And so that distraction then becomes the thing that gets in the way as well. We're distracted by all this other stuff, and it's happening because we don't know how to slow down.
Yeah, and we're talking about our well-being in general, kind of a holistic picture, and 1 Kings 19, I don't know that just off the top of my head, I've got it written down here, but a few years ago I heard John Stonestreet, these days I think he's a podcast, big-time podcast guy, but in those days he used to come out and do some teaching at what is now called the Venn Summer Conference, and I went along to a few of them, and he used to make this point about 1 Kings 19, which is where Elijah goes off and he's been on this big spiritual high, and then he goes through a period of depression. I mean, we would say, suicidal ideation, and then God sends an angel to feed him and get him to sleep. And I think that really speaks to, John Stonestreet would say, that sometimes the rest that we really need is a good meal and a good nap, And I think what you're talking about really speaks to that. We are these physical creatures, and that's inseparable from our spiritual lives, but speak specifically to the sort of spiritual dimension and the spiritual value of slowing down and finding a kind of a new rhythm or new pace of life.
It's yeah. I mean, the way we do faith probably mirrors the way that we're living our lives in our culture. You know, church copies culture, right? And so much of our church environments have become over the years a doing as well, like building big services, planning, each Sunday, and it's very organisational. Like there's all this organisation that's got to sort of take place and stuff, and that's not necessarily totally bad. Look at some of the stuff we've built, the missions and ministries that we've built, like cool stuff. But if it's all doing and striving, and that becomes another form of busyness, when really, if there's any other place where we should be grounding ourselves and just being and finding what it is, who we are in that being, then, I mean, faith has traditionally been a place where we've sort of found that. But I think we're finding that less and less within, I'm painting very broad strokes here, but we're not necessarily finding that in Christian church community, that there's actually, you come to church drained at the end of the week, but then there's a lot of noise. It's event sort of focused church rather than actual, back in the olden sort of days, like European culture and stuff, churches were these cathedrals where people would run to from the noise. You think of Les Miserables, right? Like, I mean, this guy on the run from the police, and he finds refuge in the church. That's where he goes. That picture happens often, right? I don't know whether our churches necessarily are refuges now for people running from the noise, running from everything that's going on in our world. So we have to take a look at ourselves as faith communities and, like, are we being true to what we've actually been called to be in that, or have we been duped by everything that's going on? That's not an indictment necessarily. Like, I'm not trying to, nail anyone with this. I think we need to ask that question and, like, what are we actually doing that our culture needs? If our culture's thirsty, if our culture's striving for something to bring peace and rhythm and a groundedness, a spiritual groundedness, and I think people are, they're looking for that in different places. It's like, well, we follow someone who said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest." Are people finding that in our faith communities? Are we finding it ourselves, or are we just skating along, doing our thing? And so, yeah, maybe the thing that we do need is just to pause and just reflect. COVID has in some ways been a time of pausing. It's been forced on us. I don't know that it's necessarily worked, because we're just scrambled even more so in some ways, sort of past that. But it's, I think, for many of us, not all of us, I know some people, essential workers and stuff, or people that have struggled to make ends meet anyway, it's been a really tough time, and it's not necessarily, but you hear a lot of stories of people like, lockdown, I was able to stop and find these new rhythms and actually engage with family and stuff. It's like, okay, so now you're aware of what you might be missing. How do we carry that through? And so for me, beginning of 2020, actually just stepping into space and just not knowing what was next, finding God was drawing me into a rhythm of actually slowing, of actually listening, of actually finding older rhythms, of actually stilling all the noise, all the busyness, all of that kind of stuff, and actually finding a sense of what God might be saying in this time, what God's trying to speak to us, how God might be trying to meet us and heal us in this place, because I think we're carrying wounds from the speed of our lives, where it's the harshness of our world is almost grazing our souls in some ways, so God wants to bring healing to that. Well, what does that look like, and how can we walk in that? What's the invitation in that? If we're living stressed, harried lives, okay, that's the thing. What's it trying to tell us about the way we're living?
Yeah, and you just started touching there on listening, hearing God. And one thing that really struck me about when you talked about prayer, because this is so, prayer is so kind of connected to, or maybe we should say, the fact that we so often struggle with prayer is often connected to our busyness, or at least our perception of being really busy. So that prayer becomes, if we do it at all, it becomes just another thing on our to-do list. And when I heard you speak about prayer, I was just really compelled that the way you spoke about it, it was clear to me that for you, this was more than just lists of requests to God. It was more than just, dear God, look after my family, give me this, give me that. For you, prayer seems to be much more expansive, maybe even more mystical, maybe. I don't know if that's fair, but I just wanted to hear. I know that the hearing God is a big part of prayer and the way you speak about prayer. This is not something that I really feel like I get. And I'd just love to hear you riff on this kind of idea of hearing God. What does it mean? Is it actually happening? How do we know? How does it work? What does it look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot in that, isn't there? I've just finished reading a book called How to Pray, a guide for normal people by Pete Greig, who started 24/7 Prayer Network over in the UK.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's gone global big time. And he recounts a story. He was just starting this thing out, and a relatively charismatic background, so a lot of noise, a lot of praying hard and all this stuff, and they were going to do this 24/7 prayer thing, and it was going to be intense and amazing and super cool. But he was sitting down and having lunch with Brennan Manning, the now past American writer, poet, priest, and Brennan Manning was entertaining and humouring him a little bit, and says, "So this is what you're going to pray for 24 hours. You're going to have people taking shifts, and there's going to be all these prayers happening." It's like, yeah, that's the vision. Okay, how do you know when you've prayed enough? And Pete Greig was taken back with it. It's like, how do you answer that? Like, I don't know. Like, you've got these lists that we're praying through. How do you know that you've prayed enough? How do we know that you've done it right? How do you know that we're... And he realised that, it's actually not about the doing, it's about the being. And Brennan Manning said, what if you use that time to actually just escape from everything that's happening around you and go into that prayer room and just sit for an hour and just let it all pass and actually just simply be in that space? And that was quite a paradigm shift for Pete Greig, and understanding that as well for myself, that we're so conditioned to do. And for me, growing up, prayer was this thing that we did. We would turn up to a prayer meeting, you'd go through this list on praying for this person, that person. Our personal prayers are, I was taught to do a quiet time. You get up in the morning, you read a verse, and then you pray, dear God, help me with school today, help my family, bless my brother, bless my grandparents, sort of whatever, bless this person across the road who's sick. You pray all this stuff, and that's all cool stuff. Like, there's nothing wrong with any of that. Petition is this thing that we're called to in Scripture, so that's totally do that. But it's not all of prayer. But I think we've mistakenly reduced it to probably no more than that. There's probably some complex reasons why we've done that. Maybe it's part of our enlightenment sort of wiring and upbringing, our scientific. We've got to sort of, it's what we can see and touch and feel and everything, rather than this. You called it mystical, but it is a mystery how we could pray to God, but God might return, a conversation that how do we. So your question was, how do we hear God, or how do we know we're hearing from God? That's $1 million question in some ways. But I think we've probably, again, our enlightenment minds thinks that if God speaks to us, it must be in words. Not necessarily audible, but in our hearts we hear this James Earl Jones voiceover sort of saying something literally to us, and you're like, oh, that's God, that's got to be God, And it's like, well, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's not even formed words. Maybe it's just, actually, the first thing for me is actually quietening stuff to the point that all of our own voices and fussings and flusterings have actually dulled down, and you've actually found a sense of calm at least, and then just listening into that. And what is this? I don't know. It could be just a simple impression just of, that's a picture. Where did that come from? Like, it feels like your imagination. Why did I imagine that? Well, why would you imagine that? Is that a God thing? Is that my imagination? Well, can God use our imagination? Well, sure, he gave us our imaginations. Could it be a memory of a thing from last week, a memory of a thing from childhood? Why did I think of that? Why do we retain some memories from our childhood and not others? Like, why did I remember that happening and not so many other things? Like, what is that trying to tell us? Why did that verse suddenly come to my mind? Why would I remember that? Why did I think of that person who I noticed just had that look on their face that no one else noticed, but they looked like they were struggling with something. What is those things are like super mundane, super simple. Maybe God can actually speak in those, though, if we slow down enough to notice them and then pray into that. It's like, okay, God, why did I think of that person? Maybe God's just simply in that. He's more than that. I think listening to God or hearing God is more than that, but maybe it starts there. Maybe it's actually as simple as that.
Yeah.
And learning to actually just press into that a little bit more slowly, quietly.
Yeah. And we're seeing, sorry, go ahead.
I heard someone describe God's voice the other day as being like a feather, so light that you could easily just ignore it. Or if you're in like a busy, windy street or whatever, you wouldn't even notice it was there. But in the quiet, it's substantial enough that you can notice it. And by focusing on it, you can attune yourself to it, know that it's there, and it becomes something you're more attentive to with practice, with noticing. So it's not, you told the story of Elijah, right? And he goes up in his little suicidal cave because he was in that space, and God comes and, there's this earthquake, but God wasn't in the earthquake. There's this wind that shattered rocks. Like, what kind of a wind's that, man? And God wasn't in that, but then God was in the silent, still whisper. God whispers. God seldom yells. Why is that? Maybe it's in the whisper that God's actually trying to calm our souls from the stuff in life that's happening to us and actually speak words of healing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like the James Earl Jones thing, that sort of imagining, God speaking to us like in this kind of clear kind of, this Mufasa sort of like voice, that it's exactly right. I think if we think about it that way, we're probably going to struggle way more. But we see in society, right, like there is a hunger for, even amongst unbelievers, there's a hunger for, mindfulness is so huge, various kind of centering practices, I might call it, the sense that even for people that don't believe in God necessarily or believe certainly any kind of traditional religion, still feel this need to slow down, and maybe for them it's tuning into themselves and what's going on beneath the surface, which I guess there's some value in that. But if we're indwelt by the Spirit, then I guess in a sense it does. I don't know if I want to say it doesn't matter, but there's a sense in which God can be speaking from within us, that it doesn't have to feel necessarily like something external, but that God may be speaking from the inside.
Absolutely. We're a temple of God. We're a temple of the Holy Spirit, and if God's dwelling in us through His Holy Spirit, well, why wouldn't He speak within us? We tend to dismiss that too quickly because it's too... we dismiss it without actually maybe God's in the really, really simple. I went to my wife's family and we went to Pukahina Beach beginning of last year, and it was nice. Like, we were there for a weekend. It was in January, and there were quite a few people around. And then come Monday, we had the place to ourselves, man.
Nice.
It was pretty cool, and I remember one afternoon just going out and walking down to the shop with my youngest daughter, Grace, and we quite often go out for bike rides and stuff where we live, just out at Cambridge, and it's quite a busy road. So we'll be riding along, and she'll be riding in front of me, and she's trying to talk to me. She just talks constantly, so she's trying to tell me the stuff, and I can't hear her over the trucks that are going past and stuff, but... Pukahina Beach, we had the place to ourselves. We were just walking along, and she was telling me about her morning, how she'd been playing with her cousin. They haven't always seen eye to eye, but they were like picking pippies, and one of them was holding a bucket, the other one was picking. They were working together, and it was really, really cool. She really felt like she connected with them, and it was cool. And she was telling me all this, and I was able to speak into that and say, well, actually, you guys kind of clash because you're really, really similar. When you've got a common goal, you can blah, blah, blah. And so that was just a really cool time on a quiet street. And I just had the sense later that day that God was like, it's just like that with you and me, Mark. Like, when you're rushing along in a hurry, and I'm constantly rushing in a hurry. Like, I don't want to sound like a guru with this. Like, I'm still a big flustered mess half the time. People that work with me know that. But actually deliberately making space to quieten all that, to get away from the busy roads around us and actually just walk on the quiet street with God, and He can speak into that just the same as that He's always near. God's always near. That classic verse from Philippians 4, do not be anxious about anything but pray. Don't be anxious. It's like, no, this is an invitation. Don't be anxious about anything but pray. But we forget verse 5 just before it, those 4 words, the Lord is near. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious. He's always near. Even when it's chaos and it's everything all around us, he's near. He's never far. This is where like dwelling in the Psalms and stuff is just crucial. I got a quote here from Henry Nouwen. Oh, if we could just sit for half an hour a day doing nothing except taking a simple word from the gospel, putting it in front of us, and let that truth descend from our mind into our heart. Gradually, those words are written on the walls of our inner holy place. Like just dwelling on something simple, not reading a whole book or a whole study and, the exegesis of blah, blah, blah. Like actually just dwelling on a simple verse, letting that actually go from the head and actually sink into the heart and letting that change us. And the Psalms, I mean, goodness, you don't have to travel far in the Psalms to find how God sees us, how he speaks to us. He surrounds us with his goodness. He covers us with his I'm just trying to think of some of these Psalms that I've memorised over the years, and I'm so glad I've memorised them. Like he delights in us, Psalm 18. He covers us with his feathers, shelters us with his wings. He is our refuge, our strong tower, Psalm 61. We are uniquely and wonderfully made, Psalm 139. He upholds all those who have fallen. He lifts up those who are bound down, Psalm 145. All of these speaking over us, just focusing on one of those every morning for a week, for just half an hour, as Nouwen says, letting that actually write itself on the walls of our secret place, our place where we spend alone with God. How different would it be if we then re-engage in our world with that as our identity, with that as who we are, naming us as God's beloved, we're safe and secure in God. And then knowing that we don't have as much to prove to anyone else. I talked about all my achieving and my doing as I look back and retrace my steps of my life and see how I've, the arc of my life has taken place. So much of it has been about achieving and doing, and it's trying to prove myself to other people, but actually not. It's trying to prove myself to myself because somehow I'm insecure in my identity, who I really am. And so there's a whole lot of proving that takes place, and that just gets really messy really fast because we're all trying to prove something. There's a fear mentality that comes from being threatened by someone else that's sort of tipping that up, whatever. But, I mean, to actually be rested in God says that no one can snatch us out of his hands, right? If God is for us, who can be against us? Neither height nor depth nor angels nor powers or, all of that we are safe and secure in God. We don't have anything to prove then. We can engage in the world, the people around us, without any fear because we're present in God, we're grounded in God, and so focusing on that in places of silence, of solitude, of actual stillness, like stilling ourselves from all the busyness, the flusterings, the fluffings, the doings, and actually just sitting in that long enough for it to sink right down into the walls of our heart, operating out of there. I mean, if everyone claiming Christian faith was doing that, I think it'd be a vastly different world. I just over the last little bit, I mean, we've seen, you don't have to look far across the news or whatever to see examples of Christians actually acting pretty badly, right? We laugh, but it's actually quite sad, isn't it? I mean, just seeing how Christians are perceived and then hearing people blame the media for how we're perceived. Maybe there's a bias there, but I remember Frank Ritchie telling me one time, he's a media personality, but a media chaplain as well, so he gets to talk to a lot of media people, like vast spectrum of media people. It's interesting. And he was telling me that in one of the newsrooms, they've got like a whiteboard they were printing out messages or tweets or whatever that they'd got from people, like the angry ones, and they'd post them up there, I guess to try and make light of them to help process and get through them. And it's like, you think that's bad, you want to see my one.
Right.
And he said he looked at it and it made him almost laugh and cry in equal measure because some of them were just so brutal, and clearly so many of them, the majority of them, were from people of backgrounds of faith, but antsy, like nasty, like threatened, like, people that are coming just from such a defensive posture that you're threatening me in my faith. I need to make a stand. It's like, why? I mean, no one can snatch you out of God's hand. Why do you need to make a stand? It's actually more about I want to say there, but it's us. It's all of us. We're all like that. We all carry that inner Pharisee in us, if you like. And this defensiveness that I think comes from a lack of grounding in who we really are. If we knew how secure we were, how loved we were, how God provides for us, and God's got this, all of this, then maybe we'd engage with the people around us with more grace, with more loving, with more understanding, with more compassion. And that's that church being the place of refuge again, that people know that they're going to be accepted there despite their messes. I think it was a verse from Luke, which, the parable of it wasn't a parable, I think, or was it? The Pharisee and the tax collector, or the Pharisee and the sinner, and the Pharisee was like, look at me, I'm praying, he was a great guy, and then this tax collector or the publican or whoever he was in the corner, oh, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And it's like Jesus said, that posture there is what God delights in, not this guy who's all puffed up and whatever.
So maybe just to bring this all to kind of tidy it up a little bit.
There's a lot in there, right?
Draw the threads together. I know that listeners will be thinking, man, I want this life, I want it to be less hurried and harried. I want to make more space for spiritual formation and being attentive to God's voice. So I guess a kind of almost like a two-part question. What have been what are some like practices that you've implemented in your life or that you're aware of that might be useful? And maybe also some resources that people can go to if they want to find out more.
Sure. The practices, they're not new, fancy, like, wow, this is amazing. They're really old practices. Christians have been, you mentioned like mindfulness and stuff. People are sort of seeking for that as an antidote to the noise and the busyness. And there's a bit of caution around that, I think, from Christians. They're like, ooh, sort of Eastern mysticism and stuff in there. You got to remember that some of these Eastern traditions haven't got caught up in the Western hurry quite the same way. So maybe they have retained something that we're realising could be an antidote to all of this harriedness that we're living in. So that's one thing. But the Christian tradition has that across centuries as well, and we've forgotten that recently, I think, comparatively. So silence and solitude, big time. For me, this journey kind of started. I just finished the job. I had nothing to do. I went on a weekend retreat, and we were introduced to solitude. I mean, it wasn't necessarily new for me, but was encouraged to go and take a couple of hours. We all went out and took a couple of hours just sitting in solitude, and I was encouraged to take a journal and just start writing. Like, just start writing whatever comes, and just don't put the pen down. Just keep going. And looking back on what I wrote then, it unpacked so much of what was going on, not just in here, but actually in here as well. So solitude is a place of getting away from everyone else that might name us or define us. It's just you and God, and allowing that. That can be frightening for some people. I mean, I'm like introverted as solitude's no dramas. I mean, bring it on, man. For some people, that's, where's the people gone? That's scary, but it's actually important, I think, for everyone. Maybe to lesser or greater degrees, depending on how they're wired. But solitude, and then with that silence as well, like actually just turning down the radio of our world around us, all the noises and stuff, and actually just finding that quieter space where God can then speak. That too is tough, because we're so, some people get absolutely frightened by that, because they turn down all the external noises, and then the internal noise is just like, whoa, next level. Like C.S. Lewis talked about how the most important part of the Christian life isn't from where we expect it. It's first thing in the morning we get up, and all of the noises and stuff of our world comes at us like wild animals, like, ready to go at us. And the first job each day consisting of pushing those back and listening to that truer, inner, stiller voice. That takes effort. It takes practice. It's really simple, but actually really tough as well. It takes a real determination to actually keep at that. And you could engage in that for months and really not feel any gains. But over time, it actually rebuilds a muscle memory within us of actually learning to be more at peace, learning to be more still in ourselves and our inner world, because so much of the noise actually isn't the external stuff, it's the internal stuff, and that's a human history thing, that's not new. You mentioned Brother Lawrence at the start. I mean, here's this guy practicing the presence of God, amazing dude. He writes, or someone wrote of him though, that for the first 10 years of his being in that monastery, he was absolutely harassed by his thoughts and his doubts and his fears. He thought he was too far gone to be saved by God, that he would be condemned, that he was all this stuff. For 10 years he suffered with massive anxiety to his faith. And it wasn't until he got to the utter end of himself and he basically just collapsed and just in this God save me, that God actually showed him that he'd been there the whole time, leading him through that. And then all those writings came out of that. 10 years. He was like, wow, this amazing guy, but that was a tough road. And this is like 1500 and something, right? So, but he'd been a soldier, he'd seen all this stuff, like it had been. So yeah, silence, solitude, stillness, finding ways to actually slow ourselves, that constant busyness of our world, actually slowing that down a little bit. So those are concepts, I suppose. How do we do those? Some of the older church prayer practices, the more contemplative practices like Lectio Divina, which is literally holy reading, like actually taking a small piece of scripture and then just reading it, reflecting on that, and then reading it again, reflecting on it in a different way. There's Lectio 365 is something 24/7 Prayer have brought out. It's actually an app on your phone. I mean, the phone's a distraction machine, so put it on to Do Not Disturb first so that it won't distract you. But Lectio 365, my wife Zoe, she's been doing another one called Slow, S-L-O with a potai, a little icon on the top of it. That's more of a podcast, but it's not a podcast, like it's just reflective meditative prayers, like sort of 15 minutes long, to help you actually still and dwell in that and actually just rest the noise, focusing on who you are in the present at that time, breathing, noticing your breath and slowing it down. It's like, okay, I'm anxious, like what? Calming that all down. Examen is another practice, which is more of a reflective one that's traditionally done in the evening, that came out of the Ignatians, the guys that followed Ignatius. And that's a reflective prayer over the day, asking God to illuminate the day. And, in our busyness, we tend to not reflect. So actually deliberately finding space to reflect. I find that tough at the end of the day. I find it easier to start the day quietly than to end it with reflection. But it's really important. There's a lot to be learnt in that. I found journaling really important. Just journaling my own thoughts, but then just letting the pen and even imagining what God would say to me in that time and just writing it. Sounds, ooh, that's like, what are you writing? You're writing new scripture? No. It's actually just imagining how God would name us. And so much of it actually comes out of what God already says to us through scripture. And it's like, oh, wow. And I've looked back over some of that and like, how the heck did my imagination dream up that? It couldn't have. Like, that's something else, something that I found really, really grounding. So those are practices. In terms of resources, I've mentioned Lectio 365, a really helpful one, really simple or slow. Finding, goodness, there's 1,000,001 and everyone's different, right? The things that have been helpful to me, finding better music to listen to on a work site. Like, it cracks people up that I work for, like some of the stuff they hear on my job site radio. Like, I mean, most builders listen to like Hurried or sort of whatever, and I've got pretty like either worship Christian or emo kind of stuff sort of going on, but music that you can, I'm not massive into like the Bethel kind of, worship. I mean, it's cool, nothing against it, but stuff that's like reflective, stuff that I can sing along to. Not that my singing's great, but actually singing gets into the heart as well, right? Like they say that John Wesley was the great preacher and all the rest of it, but how many of his sermons do you remember? But his brother, Charles, you'll remember a lot of his songs, right? Because we sung them over and over and over. And so we remember that theology through song. So finding better music, I mean, Spotify's brilliant for that. Like, find an artist that you can start with. Corey Asprey's a guy I love listening to. Like, there's just some depth in his music. So enjoy his stuff. But then Spotify says other artists you might like. And then you're like, oh, I've never heard of that guy. I'll listen to him. Oh, wow, this is gold. Like, listening to, just finding different stuff through that. Stuff that then speaks into you and a slower sort of rhythm. Guided prayers, written prayers. I mean, we like to pray our own prayers because we're very individualist, but actually sometimes shared common prayers. more contemplative, more traditional churches have done liturgies for years. They create a muscle memory in them because they're repeated, they're remembered. So there's stuff in that, stuff that helps you reflect. Yeah, I don't know.
It's pretty good. That's heaps. Yeah, that'll be heaps for folks to start with and get on this journey if they're not already on it. So thanks so much, Mark. It's been a real delight, and I knew it'd be great, but I'm just so stoked with how in-depth we're able to get, and I'm sure there's so much more to cover, but it was a great conversation. Let it run long because we're not in a hurry. And I know our listeners won't be, they're all super chill about time now. So, no, but it's been just great to have you on the podcast.
Can I just add that anyone listening to this, like, oh, okay, I'll give that a go. And then they go out and they're like, oh, well, I suck at this. And then they give up. It's like, this isn't about learning this new thing that we then start to master and nail. Like, I have not mastered it. Like, my prayer life's a mess. I don't want to be this guy that's like talking about prayer and people are like, oh, he's got it all together. I don't. Like, I'm a shambles. Like, I have a turbulent mind that's always all over the place. I'm still deal with stress and anxiety and all the rest of it like anyone else, but it's turning up. I mean, turning up each morning, creating half an hour of space to set aside to just be with God before we start thinking about the doings or the rush of the day, just sitting in there and just being really repetitive with it, mundane with it, just turning up. I don't think God meets us when we start getting it good and nailing it. God turns up with us turning up. God walks with us with that. God's far more interested in being with us and walking in us than seeing us like smash it out of the park sort of thing. That's a Pharisee thing. That's not the publican just being real. God wants us to be real. He wants us to find who we really are in ourselves, being grounded and actually discovering ourselves.
Thanks, man.
A lowly knowledge of thyself is a surer way to God than the deep searching of a man's learnings. It's Thomas à Kempis. So, actually being brave enough to figure ourselves out and who God created us to be is presence. It's not anti-knowledge, but if knowledge doesn't get down into presence, then we've missed something along the way. So I take presence every day.
No, that's cool, man. And I know you would never hold yourself up as a guru, but you do have some really great thoughts, and I have seen you being able to implement some of this in your life, and I know that people listening in will be really benefit from that.
It's a cool journey.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I've really been inspired by what I've heard from you. So
thanks, man.
Thanks for your time.
Pleasure.
All right, ka kite anō, everybody.
Haere rā.